At Subway, start your day the flavorful way by adding new guacamole to your favorite breakfast sandwich. Perfectly made with a hint of jalapeno, our guacamole turns up the flavor to your breakfast. Try it today on a hot and toasty egg white and cheese. Subway, eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects.
First of all,
This is the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
it might be cool, I don't know. And if it's not, I don't
The
care.
BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Bill Simmons works for ESPN. He's also named the sports guy, and he writes a comical sports column. He must be a popular dude.
The BS Report.
It's got a real dirty sound, like a rusty steak knife cutting through a well-aged steak.
Now.
Here's Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report. This really is Smart Guy Wednesday. Nate Silver in studio.
Hey, Bill.
Malcolm Gladwell on the phone.
Hi, Bill.
This is a record for Smart Guy Wednesday. I think we've passed 400 collective IQ points, and less than 100 of them are mine. You guys have never met.
No, we've met on email, and now we've met on the BS Report, but
Never physically.
it's weird. Like, I travel a whole lot, and so you can like have people who are stationed in New York, but like if you're both traveling 2/3 of the time or something, then you don't get that much overlap. But
Right, you guys.
in Brooklyn. That's the.
oh, I'm in Manhattan now. Yeah.
Oh, you are. Oh, you
Yeah,
wow.
I moved. I
Wow.
was gonna call it the upgrade, but I get like a lot of like angry stares, I think. But it's a lot more like I might like eventually write some like column or rant about this, but the convenience upgrade between because I live in like central Manhattan by like Madison Square Garden, basically.
Right.
It's like so much more convenient than Brooklyn. Brooklyn's not inconvenient, but like to be able to walk to a meeting in 5 or 10 minutes, just go back and forth between different things. If you're running around a lot, then it saves quite a bit of time.
Brooklyn does seem like it's over in the corner.
I mean, Brooklyn's pretty awesome, but I'm saying I think maybe things have gone full circle now where in a lot of neighborhoods, the rents are comparable now in Brooklyn and many parts of Manhattan, right? And so it's almost like I think there's no more arbitrage, so to speak, in moving to Brooklyn. And so I kind of wanted to be counterintuitive and move back to the city.
So the value efficiency of Brooklyn is now becoming not as much of an efficiency.
So I did a project for New York Magazine a couple years ago where we kind of rated different neighborhoods. And at that point, there was like a premium people paid just to live in Manhattan.
Right.
That you couldn't really rationalize through any other factor. But since then, rents in Brooklyn have caught up to the place where there's no more Moneyball by living in Brooklyn.
So what's the next Moneyball neighborhood?
I think Queens, honestly, right? Some of the neighborhoods in Queens, Astoria and so forth, are pretty nice and every bit as convenient to Manhattan as the kind of nicer neighborhoods in Brooklyn are. Really good food out there too. Like that's my major, like my criteria for moving to a neighborhood is like 80% food basically and 20% public transit. And like you have probably the best ethnic food on the East Coast in different neighborhoods of Queens.
Malcolm, what neighborhood do you think has the highest WAR? In baseball term.
I have no idea. I live in a tiny corner of the West Village and almost never leave. So my knowledge of New York is very minimal. I occasionally will bike across the Williamsburg Bridge.
Right.
But I think Nate's probably way ahead of me on understanding all of the differences among the neighborhoods.
Well, since the last time we had Nate on the podcast, we had Nate on in November, right after the election. You'd become, I don't want to say a character, but you'd become one of the, what's the right word? During the election, you became a storyline?
Narrative is the term they use.
Yeah,
part of the narrative about the election.
You went 50 for 50, and we spent a lot of time that day, not just in the podcast, but after, talking about what was possibly next for you. And now you're doing this website, and you're doing it within the ESPN family.
Who would have known, right?
Yeah.
There's some foreshadowing there, I think, is the term.
There kind of was.
But, no, I mean, this is really exciting. And, I'm actually out here kind of meeting with you and with David Cho and the Grantland folks, because that really is a lot of the vision for what 538 is going to be like, where we're going to be hopefully hiring a number of other smart people to write and edit and make beautiful visualizations and graphics, and just to have, 4 or 5 really compelling pieces a day. It's not going to be just in sports. I mean, sports might be a third of the content. Politics might be a third, but we also have talked about all types of areas, economics and food and education and all types of different things.
Right.
So it should be really exciting.
And this is something you have been thinking about. You basically had it in the form of the 538, but now this is blowing out what you were doing with 538.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I feel as though we achieved a lot of success in politics, certainly, but it was really just me and Micah Cohen and my editor Megan Lieberman, so really just a 3-person team. And here there are a lot of resources in terms of both the people and your experience, but also there is it's a company that brings in some revenues every year. So It's a case where you can say, look, we think it's going to be a good, solid investment to make in journalism or in design, and we think it's going to hopefully get a lot of readership and traffic and sponsorships and so forth. But it's different than being in kind of a newsroom culture where I love the New York Times newsroom, the people who run it, but it's constrained a lot from its business strategy point of view, whereas here it's like if you can dream it and justify it, right? You can't just say, I'm going to do something whimsical that doesn't make any sense. But if you can make a good case for something, then you have a lot of freedom here.
Gladwell, this sounds like a website that's kind of in your wheelhouse.
It sounds fantastic. I mean, I can't wait for it to be up and running. Can't wait to write for it. These are, can't wait to learn something a little bit more about the kind of stuff that he does. It sounds fantastic.
What did you think of one of the narratives that came out of this when it was announced? I think people were it seemed like people were a little surprised that ESPN was involved and that you were blowing out what you were doing, that you were leaving the Times. And a couple narratives emerged, one of which was, this is yet another example of newspapers, I don't want to say losing relevancy, but losing the potency that they once had. And then the other one was about this whole thing about people as brands and companies betting on a person and their vision and trying to build around that vision. Gladwell, what did you think was the most interesting angle of the stuff people were writing?
Well, I was always curious about this question of the fit between, they always try to do something really new and original and create a sort of new kind of journalism. And I was always curious about how well that would fit with the culture of newspapers, particularly because I've always thought that the paradox of industries in decline is that they get more conservative, not less conservative. You'd think the opposite would be true, right? You'd think that as everything is crashing around you, you would scramble and be most open to new ideas and most willing to try things. But the weird thing is you look at actual case studies of companies or industries in decline, how often the opposite happens, that they almost double down and become even more reluctant to examine what they're doing and change. So I was always curious, how would an industry in decline handle something entirely new?
Right.
That was to me always the great question. Kind of fascinating question.
And you felt that like there was what you were doing at the Times versus the history of what they had done and the way they were constructed, and
the Times has great journalism, but I think exactly what Malcolm is saying, right? So I'm a big fan, for example, of this Jeff Bezos purchase of the Washington Post.
I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. In part because he's someone who understands how to reinvest in a product, and the notion that, you spend $1 on an investment today on a product of journalists because you expect them to return $1.20 tomorrow, right? I think in a lot of newsrooms you have what are family-run businesses, or they're almost run as public trusts, where it's like, we'll spend $1 today. Where do we find that in our budget? Well, you can always find a budget for it if you think it's going to produce a return down the road. But they feel so budget constrained and they're so conservative in a way that it actually kind of makes things worse. I'd much rather have a guy running a newspaper for profit, where you're kind of growing the revenue pie by 5% every year. In the long run, it leads to a much larger budget for journalism and journalists in a case where you're saying, we're going to run it as a nonprofit, but we're in decline still because we're not being creative about how to generate revenues and how to launch new products and take some chances and some risks.
Malcolm, what do you think over the last 15 years, what do you think the biggest mistake newspapers made was?
Well, so to say, I think what we're seeing, the biggest mistake we're seeing and what we're witnessing now is the exhaustion of the idea of beat. So newspapers are are, and having worked for the newspaper for 10 years, it's hard to communicate to people who have never worked in a newspaper, but they are so rigidly organized around the idea that you have a specific subject area that you write about and you never wander. And if you try and wander, you get shot down. So if you write for sports, you write for sports. If you cover Wall Street, you cover Wall Street. And if you venture into politics, political guys will crawl all over you. That's just newspaper culture. I mean, you defend your turf. But to me, what's most interesting about the sort of new journalism that's arisen on the web in the last 10 years is how that was the first idea that went out the window. If you write about, like, Klosterman is interesting on sports precisely because he knows so much about rock music. That there turns out to be this really fascinating spillover between those two. And in fact, the people who read Klosterman, like myself, we're uninterested in the distinction between sports and we think it's the same thing. We think it's popular culture, or we think it's, and that's the inability of newspapers to adapt to the fluidity of modern disciplines, intellectual disciplines, modern thinking, modern pop culture. I think that's their biggest problem.
And when you look at it, I thought the Bezos articles were fascinating. I read everything. I don't know if you guys get Jason Hirschhorn's daily links that he sends out. He sent out like a special edition of like 15 different takes on it. And, you know, he seems like I don't know if he's the guy, but if we just sat in a room and tried to figure out the type of guy who could try something really interesting with the newspaper, probably pick him, right?
And this is a company that actually twice, right? First with kind of the digital marketplace, a lot of people had that idea, but they executed it, right? And also this cloud computing thing, which is now a big part of their revenue, and they invested a lot up front before that was a demonstrated and proven idea. You know, I think a lot of newspaper managers are too resigned to saying, oh, the revenue pie is shrinking, right? And if you kind of look back at the history of kind of for-profit journalism, there are always a lot of ebbs and flows as people find new ways to market content and to sell advertising and stuff. I mean, ironically, I think part of it, you had a lot of people who were buying newspapers in the 80s and 90s, which were kind of a high water mark, where you had consolidation from New York being a 12 newspaper town to 2 or 3, or Chicago from 6 to 2 or whatever, right? And that meant the remaining newspapers had a lot of monopoly power in the market. But that was not the long-term normal. That was almost like the outlier more. It's always been a business where you have to be creative and innovative, and you're not guaranteed a profit like any other industry. But because you've had another consequence of having this kind of industry in a slow decline, where you basically trim people but don't hire a lot of new blood, is you don't have a lot of kind of creativity infused through these cultures as much. So I think people say, well, the banner ad is dead, right? It might be, but I don't totally accept that at face value. And if you can find a way to kind of generate 10% more revenue per unit of content, right, then that's great for the Washington Post. It's great for their journalists, but also great for the whole industry. If you can somehow find ways to monetize content even a little bit more effectively, and all of a sudden a lot of things you felt like you couldn't budget for before, all of a sudden you're a profitable enterprise now.
What do you think of it, Malcolm?
Well, I have 2 notes of skepticism about it. One is, I think Bezos is an incredibly smart guy. I think everyone thinks that. One is he buys it for himself, not for his company, which suggests he's not that, if he bought it for his company, I would have thought, oh, he has a kind of grander scheme for integrating the Post into this formidable organization that he's built. But if he's buying it for himself, it doesn't seem like that's top on his list. And the other thing is, it's a big deal to us that he bought it. It's a big deal to people like myself who used to work at the Washington Post. He bought it for 1% of his net worth. It's a rounding error. We may be overstating how big a deal this is for him. Maybe he just thinks, why not? Play with it for a couple of years, see if it's interesting, maybe move on. In terms of his empire is now so vast that this is he went out for a cup of coffee. He didn't make some massive commitment.
Or we might be understating it, and this is super important for him, and he feels like he can be at the leading front of somebody who changed journalism and saved newspapers and all that.
It's hard to know, but yeah, I guess the irony, people think it'd be great if he just kind of ran this as a patron, right, and have to take some losses. Whereas I think it would be much better for the Post if he's trying to run it in a for-profit way, because he's someone who can actually grow the revenue pie and find better ways to market content and increase the value of good journalism, whether it's on the web or print or if those lines become less important. So I hope he's more invested and kind of wants to make a profit from it.
I think he is. Like the stuff I read about it, it seems like he put about, spent 9 months like getting to know people and trying to figure out whether he wanted to do it. Also seems like he's maybe a tiny bit eccentric, can we say? Like the 10,000 hour clock thing, which I read the articles on, and I still don't totally understand what it is, but he's poured in millions and millions into this idea, and I don't. Do you guys understand what the clock is? I don't totally get it.
No, not there. My worry about these newspaper purchases thing with John Henry is that outsiders may perceive that running a newspaper is more fun than it actually is. So being a general manager of a basketball team, really, really fun, right? Limited number of very, very high stakes decisions, plus the trade machine, which, as you, Bill, have demonstrated, is hours. Talk about thousands of hours of good fun every year.
Yeah.
That's, and as you go down the list, as the organizations that you're a part of get larger, the job gets slightly less fun. So I think being an NFL general manager, not as fun as basketball, because now you're making, 30 or 40 key decisions a year as opposed to 5. A newspaper is about as far from a basketball team as you can imagine. You don't have any. There's no LeBron Jameses. What you have is hundreds and hundreds of people, all of whom who contribute to the overall health of the enterprise in some small, almost immeasurable way every day. It's incredibly hard work. It's incredibly time-consuming. It's incredibly involving to try and make that better. This is a guy who's running a $100 billion business. He doesn't have time to do that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, and also the unions, the NBA analogy you used, this is like if everybody was on a 35-year contract, which makes it tough to change the roster. But, I thought one thing that I thought was interesting about how he handled the Amazon, which I got to be honest, I didn't really know that much about what he did with Amazon until I read up this week, just because I was fascinated by it. And I didn't realize how much money he put back into Amazon as he was building it, and instead of just grabbing the revenue left and right, like he was using whatever money they had in to build all these centers where they build different stuff. And he had like a long-term plan for it. It wasn't like, this is the next 9 months. Here's what I'm doing. He's like, here's the next 10 years. Here's what I'm doing. And it makes me think if he applies that to the Washington Post, which in my opinion, there's only 3 newspapers that truly matter, right? The Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Like, those are the 3 we can't lose that can't get effed up in any way. Everything else could turn into an online site and it would be semi-okay. But if he applies that thinking to the Washington Post, figures out some sort of long-term plan, obviously he has some ideas. I don't feel like this was a lark for him. I feel like this is important to him. I
hope so. I think Malcolm's also right, though, that you do have some kind of legacy costs, right? When you're kind of cutting staff, it's, I guess the economic term is you have some stickiness, right? Where you can't just say, let's kind of trim the 5% of the inefficiencies, right? You have different types of people who are in different types of contracts, some functions that are unionized and some that might not be, right? And so that's almost why I think if you're willing to reinvest some money and grow the product, because cutting, you can trim, but you're going to get some layers of fat and some bone, and it might not be all that efficient necessarily, right? Not to say there isn't any fat in newsrooms. I think there always is, and I think it's good to have more turnover. But
what if he looked at it and he just said 6 months in, you know what? It makes no sense to print newspapers anymore. Let's go online. Everything is online, and we'll save X amount by not even having to worry about printing it and delivering it. Could you see that happen, Malcolm?
Yeah, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that they're still deriving a significant portion of their profits from the print side of the advertising equation. But yeah, he's got nothing. In essence, he's got nothing to lose, right? He has no stake in the system. He's accustomed to blowing things up. He has incredibly thick skin. I mean, he's run essentially a business that makes $0 for the last 10 years, 15 years, and he hasn't, none of the criticism or skepticism has bothered him one whit. So if anyone's going to have the balls to do it, it's him.
Remnick's piece yesterday, which I really liked, and in that piece, it was talking about how the Graham family, it wasn't like they were just losing money the last couple of years. Like every year for the last 12, things were declining, even as they were cutting stuff and making little fixes left and right, and it was still going down. And, and I'm sure Remnick is friends with the Graham family and wanted to paint them in a favorable light, but you did get the feeling that this was not a day that they wanted to come. Like they had tried to figure out every conceivable way to save this. Yeah. And just looked at it and said, you know what, this is going to keep losing money, and what do we do? And maybe this is, you have somebody like Bezos is worth $250 billion or whatever. What is he, 250? What is he worth?
If it's 1%,
250 billion? 25 billion? Yeah, I'm not good at math. 25 billion. That's maybe the kind of guy who should own a newspaper like this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm a little bit more of a skeptic about this, only in the sense that my brief experience with people who've done well in Silicon Valley is that they think that the rules that govern success in the Valley govern success in the rest of the world. So you have all these, I'm not talking about Jeff Bezos here, but there are no shortage of 32-year-old quadrillionaires from the Valley who think, if only we apply the same 6 lessons I use in my software firm, we can transform American government. There's all that kind of thing. And then, they just have no appreciation for the complexity of more traditional domains, right? They come from this place that's this sort of pure meritocracy with VCs lining up to give you billions of dollars, where change happens instantaneously, where markets get transformed overnight. And they don't understand that outside the world of tech, that's not the way things operate. So some little part of me says, there may be a little bit of hubris in store for Mr. Bezos.
And I look at it, I just think about what my life was like in the mid-'90s when I wanted to write. I wanted to get a sports column. That was my goal. So I had 2 newspapers in Boston, a weekly alternative, which was called The Phoenix, and the Boston Magazine. Those are my 4 choices in Boston. There's no internet yet. Yeah. And every city basically had some variation of that same thing. So newspaper had incredible weight and could cherry pick the most talented young people and all this stuff. And now you think about how much that's changed. It's almost like looking at what's happened in television, where, in 1980, when I was 10, we had 13 channels, and now there's 700. And if you're a major network now, you're not just competing against the same networks you were competing against before, but you're going against 50 movie channels. You're going against AMC and FX and all these people who can take more creative chances than you can take and cherry pick some of the best young people. That's a decent analogy?
Well, a couple of points. I mean, first of all this, we talk about it, as people who are in the industry, so to speak. We think about it from the point of view of our kind of friends and colleagues, but it's great for consumers, right? Where you can read so widely now and watch television so widely, and that produces like social dividends, I think. But also now, I mean, you have less monopoly power from the publishers, and also you have more kind of metrics on who drives traffic and who doesn't. And the unfortunate truth for the most part in most parts of publishing is that it's pretty top heavy, where you have some people who drive a lot of coverage. You have some people who produce great kind of high prestige. I mean, the foreign policy journalism, I hope the Times and the Post keep investing more and more in, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also some stuff that's more close to replacement level, where anything you publish in a high prestige publication will get read, but where the journalist isn't adding as much value potentially. So kind of figuring out where you are on that curve, it becomes uncomfortable, I think, for organizations who assume that they provide all the value, where now you kind of can know more explicitly what's the New York Times contribution versus the editors versus the journalists or the writers and so forth.
Malcolm, how do you think the New Yorker's role has changed as this has all been going on?
Well, I mean, we are doing better than ever, which is a function of a number of things, but the big driver is that overseas markets, the web allows people overseas to get to New Yorker at the same time as everyone else. So that turns out to be a huge deal, right? Because if you live in Indonesia now, you can participate in the conversation on an equal footing with someone living in Washington, D.C., and so you're willing to subscribe, and that subscription is just money in our pocket.
Right.
So we by being a kind of weekly, more contemplative, very, very niche magazine, we're one of the winners of this this revolution. But that's, all those things are what make us absolutely distinct from newspapers. Newspapers are on the absolute other side.
It's interesting. I think if you look at all the, newspapers, magazines, basically anything, just how they've evolved over the last 30 years, an issue of the 2013 New Yorker looks almost exactly like it did in 1993, right? I mean, it's in a lot of ways has changed the least, but has done the best job of keeping all the stuff that was good about it while also kind of moving digitally into that right space.
Well, branding and differentiation is important. So this kind of curve where it becomes top heavy. It's also true where the best publications from 20 years ago are getting in general like kind of more like mind share now, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how much bandwidth of the news hole does the New York Times occupy, it's more now than it was 20 years ago. And I think likewise also for the New Yorker and probably the Post, right? So it's kind of an odd mix where it's a winner take all or winner take most environment in the one sense. On the other hand, the overall industry is shrinking. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like this will get me in trouble maybe, but I feel like with all the traffic the Times has right now, it should be turning a much larger profit than it does right now, right? They get so many eyeballs and so much high quality traffic. The demographics are really good. People with a lot of disposable income. That should be a gold mine for advertisers. And if they're having trouble selling that, then I think you shouldn't blame the environmental conditions so much as maybe your sales staff isn't that good.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then you look at the New Yorker is on one end. I think Vanity Fair is another magazine that has figured out that monthly model. And there's been some others, but then you look at, Newsweek, which just got sold again. You look at Sports Illustrated and what's happened to their foothold over the last 20 years. For some, it just hasn't worked. I think the concept of a weekly magazine where you're kind of reflecting back on what happened, I don't know if that works anymore.
Well, but having said this, Grantland in some ways has some magazine type properties where you're not trying to be first, you're trying to be best.
Right.
That's interesting. And 538's that way too, where we're a tiny bit more newsy than you guys, but not a lot more, right? Where it's more like we want to have the smart take on something, the more kind of authoritative and comprehensive or fun or well written or well displayed take that you'll read on something and not be first. I mean, the problem with being first is that it doesn't take that much skill to be first, and so you can have an operation that's fast, but unless you're like Bloomberg News or something where you literally kind of post things almost based on an algorithm instantly, it's easy to replicate, right?
But you don't want to be late either.
You don't want to be late.
I think that's what something like Newsweek,
and
where they're writing
in an odd
5 days
hole
later.
Where you don't have the most interesting take on something and it's slow, you have to differentiate in some way. And I say I'm not a speed guy, right? I'm through quality, but you can't be the third fastest and the fourth best take. No one's gonna.
So the algorithm is simple. The later you are, the smarter you better be, right?
Yeah.
Inverse proportion.
And then the New Yorker's done a nice blend of, being very reflective and having or trying to have one of the smartest takes, or in a lot of cases the smartest take. But also, you guys have reacted pretty fast to stuff too. Like even yesterday, Remnick's thing on the Washington Post, which. Obviously, I don't think that was in the magazine this week. That was just web only, but that was a really good take.
I had dinner with him that night. He was doing his reporting at the table. It was unbelievable.
Wow!
In the middle of the restaurant, he's scribbling notes on the tablecloth for a piece he wrote after we had dinner in the evening. But David, he's a hardcore journalist, right? He came up. He's his most famous moment at the Washington Post was when he had 3 front page stories in one day.
Wow.
Jesus.
That's the kind of guy he is.
It's like the triple crown of.
Seriously.
Yeah. He's got, in the NBA terms, they would say he has a motor.
Right.
I mean, one thing we're thinking about doing at 538 is making more of a distinction between what we call features and blogs, where it offers a different value proposition to the reader. And with blogs says, look, this is something that went up thoughtfully, but fairly quickly, right? It hasn't received as thorough an edit, but where you do kind of prize speed a little bit more, but label it differently and don't mix and match so much. Whereas a feature, look, we're gonna we talked about this yesterday, right? If things aren't up to our standards, we're gonna kill a lot of pieces, right? We're not gonna put up mediocre content at 538 as you guys don't at Grantland, but it promises different things to the reader and explaining what the value proposition is and kind of, what can they expect, and managing those expectations is a really big part of this. And again, a case where Newsweek, I think, didn't really kind of hit the sweet spot. It was almost the worst of both worlds, although they still had some very good journalists, right? It was kind of dumbed down in a way that was unfortunate, I think.
The other interesting thing that's happened is, and this is totally different than even it was 5 years ago, Twitter and Facebook and these other ways of just finding out about things somebody wrote, right? If somebody, I really honestly believe this. In 2013, you could write a really good piece, and it could be anywhere. And if it's really good, it's going to get shared, and people are going to find out about it. I think something that a good recent example of this is, I think it was, I don't want to screw this up, but I think it was called The Rape Joke, and it was somebody that had written for The All. It was a female writer, and it was basically her take on this whole argument that has been happening online about whether comedians should be allowed to joke about rape or not. And she just decimated everybody, and it was one of the best pieces I've read this year. I don't go to The All, but I saw it on Twitter 5 different times. I had it emailed to me 3 different times. Like, there was no way I was going to miss this. And I think in 2013, that's probably the best thing you can ask for. Like, people, they worry about writers getting paid, writers writing for free. But at least now, if you write something good, people are going to eventually see it. And I think that's at least a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of think, well, what's the kind of macro level business model? And part of it is, I think, is curating content, really, right? So someone goes to a certain site and they're kind of guaranteed. So, Grantland, I think, is a site now where you go and you actually go to that front page because you are guaranteed to see a couple of interesting pieces every day. But there aren't that many websites like that. And again, it's a case where the kind of middle ground gets left out a little bit, right? It's like, because I know I can catch anything super interesting on Twitter,
right,
then it means there are only maybe 4 or 5 sites that I visit out of habit every day.
That's the danger, is because, and our goal with Grantland from the get-go was we want to be something that people feel like they have to go check once a day. And if your hope is that people come back multiple times a day, but we were okay with somebody who's working 12 hours a day who might only have time to go to 5 different websites that day, and we wanted to be one of the 5. Or maybe they come once a week. And so a big part of our goal going out of the gate was, don't put up too much stuff. Don't put up too much meaty stuff. Try to make it easy for somebody if they only come once or twice a week to see what's there. But I think, just look at it from a time standpoint. There's only so much time in the day. If you're building a site like what you're trying to build right now, you want to be one of the 8 or 9 sites that people are going to that day.
Well, we know if you look at web traffic kind of hour by hour, it basically, especially for sports content or kind of finance content, that kind of thing, it peaks during the hours of the workday, right?
Yep.
It's people are killing time at work by reading the web. At home,
and class. Don't forget about class.
And school,
people are in
absolutely.
class reading columns.
Yeah, but so kind of getting up at something good at 8:30 every day, and then maybe at the lunch break, and then maybe at 5:30 as people are kind of checking out for the day, timing that schedule to the flows of kind of the American corporate workday or school day is something which is probably a smart strategy.
And the other thing I think that's been great for this has been the iPad. And just think, like 5 years ago, we had no idea the iPad was even coming.
Yeah.
You could go on vacation now. You could be in freaking Mexico reading Chad Ford's Mock Draft 7.0 on ESPN.com. That's amazing, too. I mean, 20 years ago, you'd be lucky to get some foreign USA Today when you're on vacation. Malcolm, what else do you think? What else are your favorite things about what's changed as we head into the end of 2013 here?
Well, I mean, I feel that all of my obsessive tendencies have been accentuated by the web. I have far more, like if I just think about the way I consume sports, I spend huge amounts of time every day on letsrun.com, just for serious track and field fans. And I know way too much about Alan Webb, formerly great American milers who haven't run well in 5 years. I mean, at a level of detail and specificity that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago when I got my sports from, or 15 years ago, when I got my sports from reading Gary Smith articles in Sports Illustrated. It's so strange how the kind of knowledge that I'm consuming now is so different.
Yeah, and it's like, if you're really into something, you have to almost either be all in. We were talking about this last night because I barely write about baseball anymore. I still watch the Red Sox. I still know what's going on, but there's a level that I'm just not at. And I just feel like when I see like even somebody like Jonah, who's doing great stuff for us on Greatland, the level that you have to be at to write about it in a really smart way, it's almost all or nothing. It's all consuming.
Baseball especially. I mean, I've had the experience where, I've been focused on elections the past 4 years, and those peak in October, November, right? So it's like every other year I basically miss the baseball playoffs, and you feel like quite a bit behind. Now, we're going to hire lots of other people to write about sports for 538, but I do think even for us, it is more like, can you find an angle that you can speak to really well instead of trying to cover every nook and cranny of a sport?
Or doing it just to do it.
Or doing it just to do it, right?
Yeah.
So let's say, we're talking about what we're going to do in basketball, for instance, right? We're probably not going to invent like a super stat or projection system at first, but, I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of looking at the trade-offs when a guy takes a shot, right? The high volume scores, how many of them really are in situations where the team's not surrounded by good, efficient players and you're running out the shot clock and you have to launch something up versus guys who are kind of ball hogs, basically. And there are probably ways to measure that, and we hope to look at that. But that's something which is a kind of bite-sized chunk of something versus saying, we're going to solve the entire game of basketball, the entire game of player evaluation, right? You kind of do take little bits and pieces of it and specialize in those. And it's kind of, it is narrative in a sense, right? Where you're kind of trying to explain something in a narrow sphere that people can then think about and apply to broader spheres. But, like I said, it is almost more of a kind of feature, kind of magazine, kind of glossy mentality where you blow certain things out in a really compelling way instead of trying to cover a little bit of everything.
And you felt like at the times you actually wanted to write. You didn't write as much sport as you would have wanted to.
Well, partly it's like just my own bandwidth is constrained. The Times is actually pretty good about this thing Malcolm was talking about earlier, where they're flexible about the sports desk. I was happy to work with there, or the business desk and so forth. But my pieces take as yours do, Bill. I mean, we're all people who tend to write pretty long, and we all kind of care about our prose. So it's not like I can just turn something around.
You're not cranking it out.
Yeah, so now it's like to actually have more of a team I can work with where I can we'll have a sports person and we'll have lunch or whatever and kind of trade ideas and then develop something together, or that person might write the piece. I mean, I probably will be writing a little bit less about politics now, not so much of the kind of daily grind or the play-by-play. It's also the case, by the way, that this is not a super interesting year in politics right now. You go back to Monica and the 2000 election and 9/11 and 2004 was a close election. 2008 was historical, right? 2012 was another close election. A really good run of political events that, again, we look at things, we assume this is kind of the new normal when it's really an outlier, right? Politics were pretty boring for during the mid 90s and so forth when Clinton blew out Dole, not much to write about really. So, I think it kind of, you look at where the news cycle is going, and I'm kind of aware that 2016, I think, will be fascinating. But, I'll be frank, I think the 2014 midterm is going to be dull as compared to most recent elections. There's not as much at stake where we know the GOP is going to control at least one branch of Congress, almost for sure. We know Obama's in the White House through 2016. So you don't really have control of all of D.C. at stake, and that makes it less compelling.
I actually think 2016 is going to be potentially the most fascinating.
Oh, that'll be epic.
Since 1980, maybe?
Maybe. I mean, we've been lucky, actually, 80 and 2000 and 2008. But you're going to have.
I'm talking about multiple people that are, the thing interesting about 80 was Ted Kennedy was involved.
Mm-hmm.
You had somebody who was running for re-election who lost, which, isn't the most common thing. Reagan, and there's just a lot going on. It feels like 16 might be headed that way.
It feels like it. I mean, this country has a lot of crises to resolve, right?
Yeah.
You certainly are going to have so it used to be that in the Democratic Party you had these big fights, right? Because you had the different constituencies like the union voters and the kind of white liberal progressives and the college students and the African Americans and the Hispanics. And now because Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are such dominant figures, Democrats are a bit more unified, whereas the GOP, always kind of the party that was supposed to get in line behind the front runner. I mean, I don't know how you bridge the gap between the libertarians and the moderates and the religious right and the Tea Party and kind of the country club Mitt Romney establishment vote, right? They're all going to have their own candidates they support.
Yeah.
You're going to have support split 4 or 5 different ways, and that's going to be incredibly interesting to see that play out, I think.
Malcolm, what was your favorite election?
Well, I'm Canadian, so it would be probably something involving Pierre Trudeau.
Oh, stop it.
I have not been able to wrap my mind around American politics. I've been here in this country for 20 years. I can't do it. I find it sort of baffling and weird. And
that's a great answer. Wait, you brought up runners before, and I wanted to talk about PEDs while we had you, because obviously the country has gone just haywire with A-Rod and biogenesis, and I know you were super duper rattled by what happened with the track stars recently. Have you reached a point with track where you just assume nobody is clean unless you have proof otherwise?
Well, it's funny. I've just been reading. I'm doing a piece on this for the New Yorker right now. I went back and I was reading Tyler Hamilton's book. He was in Lance Armstrong's team, on Lance Armstrong's team in the early 1999, 2000. He wrote this of tell-all. In that era, in that period, it sounds very much like anyone who was anything in cycling doped, and if you didn't dope, you were nothing.
Right.
We could make the same argument about baseball, right? There's an era where basically all the top 10 hitters in the game, it now looks like, in retrospect, over a 5-year span, overwhelming number of them were doping.
The top 6 single-season home run totals are from 1998 to 2001.
Yeah. So I think this is true. There's always in whatever realm you want to look at, these things come and go in waves. Different kinds of patterns of illegal drug use tend to predominate. I don't think you're ever totally clean, but in baseball you go from the amphetamine, the greenies era, to anabolic steroids, and now everyone's using, sounds like, I don't really know for sure, but it sounds like what everyone's doing is topical testosterone, right? Moved away from human growth hormone, going to T in that hard-to-detect form. I don't know what era running is in right now. When I look at times in the 1,500 meters and the 5,000 from the kind of mid to late 90s, interestingly enough, the same era of PED dominance in baseball, they're way out of whack. People were running times in that era that don't make any sense today. Routinely running 3:27, 1,500 meters. Like, what? It just hasn't happened.
Right.
So I don't know, but like I said, so there I would say, I think that was probably a little era of heavy PED use in track then. I don't know now. Is Bolt using? I doubt it somehow. I mean, and think about if you look at what they caught Mustafa Powell and Tyson Gay with last week, it was stimulants. It was really penny ante stuff. This was not the hard stuff.
Yeah.
This is too many, I'm exaggerating, but this is like too many cups of coffee. I mean, you could make a very, very strong argument stimulants shouldn't even be outlawed in sprinting. I mean, it's sort of absurd. So I don't know whether that is a signal in the sprint game at the moment of heavy drug use.
I feel like you have to, in a sport, pick one or the other extreme, right? Whether you have to have super harsh and severe penalties where there are real disincentives to take steroids or PEDs, or, as some other American sports might, is kind of just say, what's the big deal, right? It's an open secret, and we're not going to be all moralistic about it, right? And, we'll kind of slap guys on the wrist, but...
Isn't that what football's doing?
Yeah, NFL's a big partner of ESPN, so I want to... But
please.
Yeah. No, for
we
sure,
hammer them all the time.
So, dude, either take the sprinting route or the NFL route, right? I think it has to be one of those two.
The NFL says 4-game suspension and we'll never say what you did, so you can just make up your own whatever the excuse was.
Yeah.
So all of them say Adderall, and who
and
knows?
By the way, in an 18-game season, why wouldn't you go for the 4 days? It's just,
Right.
No, it's quite rational. I mean, that's the weird thing is,
irrational.
are you being a bad teammate on some level by not sacrificing your long-term health by taking PEDs, right?
Well, Malcolm, let's say, total hypothetical.
Yeah.
Let's say Kobe Bryant could return for opening night, and if he was able to get some performance-enhancing help to help him recover from his injury.
Yeah.
And then the season starts and he no longer uses anything. But would you be okay with somebody who's recovering from an injury being able to use whatever they want to help their body recover?
I have always been clear on this. This is the part that there's so many parts of the PED controversy that baffle me. I can't follow the argument. This is precisely a place where I can't follow the argument. That is to say, if I have carpal tunnel syndrome and I can't type, I'm allowed to do whatever it's expected. I would go to a doctor and he would give me medication to help me recover. You're in recovering from injury. It's in everyone's interest that you recover from injury as quickly as possible, particularly if your job depends on you performing at a high physical level.
Yep.
Why is the use of PEDs to recover from injury considered to be a crime? In cycling, one of the banned substances, Tyler Hamilton talks about this, is cortisone. If you were caught taking, in fact, Lance gets caught taking a cortisone shot at one point, and he has to come up with a elaborate story to get out of it. But it raises the question: cortisone? Are you kidding me? I get cortisone shots. All of us would at some point in our life. And if you're a cyclist training like a maniac, the idea that you would take away a substance which helps you to. Same thing with testosterone, by the way. One of the main reasons people use testosterone is to recover from the inevitable stresses of incredibly high pressure sports. If the NFL has an 18-game season, or if you're in the Tour de France, which is how many weeks? 3 weeks. The normal human body cannot perform at that level for 3 weeks. If you want people to get through that, you have to give them some help in recovering. That's what medicine is all about. I don't know why we're having a conversation where we're trying to deny athletes from the benefits of modern medicine. Isn't that crazy?
Well, and then on top of it, Tommy John surgery or all the painkillers these guys use to recover, especially football players. That's the part that's really nebulous to me. We're saying certain things are bad, but then these things are okay.
Yeah.
And then it's okay to put a dead guy's knee ligament in my elbow. That's not cheating the system at all. But it's not okay if I used whatever to try to help me recover better. That's the part I don't get. And that's like, there's no overseeing body that helps us with this. Like the leagues basically have the commissioners, but like, look at what's happened in the NBA right now. So there's no executive director of the Players Union right now. The league, they say, and I don't know why we wouldn't believe them, but the league has said we really want to start testing for HGH. We want to make our PD program better, but we can't because there's nobody in charge of the Players Union right now. So now we're going into the 2013-14 season, and the league, if you listen to them, is saying, well, hey, we tried. We don't know who to call. We did our best, but there's nobody running. And the Players Union obviously is going to delay that as much as they can. They don't want PED testing. So now we're heading into this season. They have the worst testing program of the 4 major sports by far. They don't test HGH. They don't have biological passports, obviously. They have this testing system where you do 4 tests during the regular season. After the 4th test, you don't get tested again. So it could be a free-for-all if you wanted it to be. You get tested up to twice during the summer. To me, that's not adequate. But their argument is, well, what are we going to do? Nobody's in charge of the Players Union.
Well, people say that the PAD test is really an IQ test on some level, right? If you kind of know when the tests are being administered and you're able to just kind of skirt the law. I mean, it is difficult. There's no perfect solution here. I do think that, ironically, in baseball, because it's so stats focused, right? Because, Babe Ruth's record or Hank Aaron's record, or Roger Maris, I should say, are so sacred, right? That people felt violated, I think, in a different way there. But, I also think, I'm pulling back a little bit from politics in part because all the moralizing that takes place there. It's like, let's have some fun, right? I mean, there are always ebbs and flows in sports, but you have a certain...
Here's my proposed solution, which is you combine the best of both systems. So you were talking earlier about, Bill, about these two poles where you care a lot and where you don't care. Let's combine the best of both. So let's have a system that has a biological passport that tests people all the time, so we absolutely know without a shadow of a doubt what anyone is using at any given time. But then let's remove every single penalty associated with the use of those drugs. In other words, you can do whatever you want, but everyone's going to know, right? So if I want to be Barry Bonds and hit 67 home runs, 73 home runs in a year, I just say I did it, but then here's what I used to get there. And if I want to be clean and hit, 48 home runs, I can say, well, and I'll leave it up to the fan and everyone else to decide, is a clean 48 better than a doped 73, right? If Kobe, so in cases like basketball or football, where we don't really care that much about, then it's fine. Kobe says, I'm using the following things, and we say, well, look, he's 30-something, he's been injured. I think that's fine. We make up our minds. We're adults. If Usain Bolt is using massive amounts of testosterone, we also make up our minds and we say, no, wait a minute. I don't accept that. So we could discount as fans whatever time. I just think we're adults here. Let's make our own decisions about what's useful and what's not.
We kind of did see this happen with Kobe a little bit, right? He went to Germany and I made a million jokes about it, but he went out of the country to get an operation on his knee that was not legal in this country. And his knee played better. Everybody was kind of okay with it because it was like, all right, well, so we get more Kobe? Like, this is okay. This isn't the worst thing that's ever happened.
And by the way, this would help the general cause of medical science. I think that there are thousands of people out there who would benefit from the knowledge of what it was that Adrian Peterson did to recover from his knee injury. Come on, this is like a hugely important piece of information. The dude did something so completely unbelievable. If I tear up my knee, I want what he had.
Well, is it conceivable that maybe just science is really good now, and maybe we know so much about the body and we have so many different ways to stimulate tissue and do things naturally that Kobe, I don't think he should have said anything in China. I think there was a mistake on his part to kind of brag about his recovery as the A-Rod thing's going on. But maybe science is better now.
I think you can make a distinction between, are there products that do long-term harm to the athlete, right? Because then you have a case where if you're not taking them, then you're sacrificing for yourself, but also hurting your team, right? Say anything that is actually going to improve or at least be neutral for your health outcome in the long term, your life expectancy, go ahead, right? Open borders on that. But then you do ban things that have much near-term advantage they give you or don't give you that are harmful to your long-term health outcomes. I mean, there is kind of and Malcolm's written about this stuff.
Wait. If we're concerned about people's long-term health,
fair enough.
Football. Here comes the football. Right? You teed up Gladwell.
There's this moment in Tyler Hamilton's, Tyler Hamilton writes this book, which is against the use of, saying he was wrong to use PEDs. But there's a moment in the book where he tackles this question of long-term health. He says, look, and he lists all of the injuries he suffered while riding a bike. He says, this is an insanely dangerous sport. If you're worried about my health, you shouldn't have let me ride my bike in the first place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all of these sports, with the exception of, essentially sedentary sports like baseball, get in trouble with that, but they're not basketballs. I mean, they're not inherently healthy activities.
Right. I think there's two levels of PEDs, right? The first level is like Ben Johnson, his eyes turning yellow, and him just looking fake as you're looking at him, and him beating Carl Lewis in a way that just didn't seem normal. And Barry Bonds, his head actually growing, and Barry Bonds' performance literally changing from what we had seen.
Can we talk about Barry for a moment?
Sure. I'd love to.
So here's the thing that I am still in the dark about Bonds. So Bonds changes over the course of his career. You and Nate will know this much better than I am because I'm not a huge baseball fan. But as I understand it, it isn't just that his performance improves at the end of his career. It's that the way in which he played the game changed, or the way in which he hit changed. Yeah. He became someone who for example, began to walk an astonishing amount. Now,
Right.
I always heard anecdotally that, it's because taking PEDs improves your eyesight. So I asked my cousin, who's the head of ophthalmology at UCSF, is this true? He said, no, it's not true. So Bonds made a correction, an adjustment to his the way he hit the ball late in his career that had the effect of vastly improving his performance. And it may be completely fallacious to say that that was in any way connected to his use of PEDs. In other words, we don't know how much of his late-stage surge is due to his own intelligence as a player and how much is due to the fact that he ingested massive amounts of pharmaceuticals.
Nate
Right?
has.
I mean,
Nate has your answer.
I don't have an answer, right? Because you're right. You can't. There's no like algorithm you can run and say, oh, this much is this much is that. I think you can have, nonlinear or synergies in the case of a guy like Bonds, where he's smart enough to improve his plate approach, something almost no one's ever done, right? But you also have so much power when you do take a swing and so much bat speed that a pitcher has to fear you, and so you kind of go off the charts. But there are also lots of guys who wrote a chapter for this about 6 years ago for a book, Baseball Between the Numbers. I mean, there are lots of guys who took steroids and got worse, right? Jeremy Giambi, the brother of Jason Giambi, was a guy who was a pretty bright prospect and started taking steroids and all types of other things and stunk. And
I think Eric Gagne is a good example. Like he had 2 great years basically, and then his arm came off his body, and that was it.
I mean, the one thing about the guys who are known, they all work their butts off, right? If you take a bunch of steroids but don't do any work behind it, then it's not going to make you much better. It might just make you more injury prone. But if you're as much of a stubborn, guy as Barry Bonds, right, and really devoting yourself to the sport, and then take steroids, then you get some big kind of.
It also, we use the word steroids. I'm not sure how much steroids he was taking. Wasn't he taking the Clear, which was he had moved on to far more sophisticated substances.
Right.
These days, very few people are taking anabolic steroids anymore. In fact, very few people are taking human growth hormone, which a couple of years ago they were all taking. This science is constantly evolving, and some of these, it really makes a difference how you cheat. Some of the guys who cheat and didn't get better were just bad at cheating. I mean, you said before that these things are an IQ test. This is also an IQ test, right? You've got to have the smart doctor. The dumb doctor who just shovels you a bunch of crap, that's not necessarily going to help you.
Well, that's why I'm fascinated by Lance Armstrong, because he really was like the greatest cheater ever. He had people trying to catch him for how many years? 12?
Yeah.
And he was able to stay ahead of them. He was like John Dillinger, like staying ahead of the police. And just the French, I think they had stopped the country to try to get him, and they couldn't do it. I think the steroids and the PEDs and all that stuff are just better now, because you look at even the way wrestlers and football players looked in the 80s and the early 90s, and the giant weird necks. And remember, like when we were growing up, like the communist countries, like some of the women on the female track stars in like East Germany, and you're like, oh my God. What is going on?
Ender.
They don't look like that anymore. Like the science is better. So if you're cheating, it's not actually altering your
side
appearance.
effects.
And I think in football and in basketball, if it's happening, like these guys are muscular, but you wouldn't think like they don't look like freaks.
I think that this goes to the emphasis now is much more on recovery. That what we've understood is if you devise an incredibly intensive and intelligent workout regimen, and then you take things like testosterone between workouts in some way, what you're doing is you are essentially recovering fast enough to be able to come back to the workout quicker and stronger. And if that's the game you're playing, it's a much more sophisticated game than people were playing. And that even in if you read, I'm reading this Tyler Hamilton book, and he's talking about how they cheated. I mean, it's incredible. They had the way in which they were taking cortisone, testosterone, EPO, and then they were blood doping. They were withdrawing blood and then reinfusing it. And all of those steps were precisely integrated into their workout regimen. It was the same guy designing their workout was the guy who was running their drug protocol. So they don't, sometimes we think of the drugs are the things you take on the side to kind of. It's not. It's the same. It's part of the same methodical, rational, efficient, ruthless approach to getting better. they don't draw. Grants does not draw a distinction. Did not draw a distinction between taking a shot of EPO and going for and doing 25 reps up a mountain with every one of his physical signs being monitored in real time. I mean, that's to him it was all of a piece.
Gladwell, if we did one of our email exchanges and you found out after the fact that I had used a ton of Adderall and HGH to try to beat you in the email exchange.
Thank God. High time Simmons got the help he needs.
Because I do hear from college people that that Adderall it's a real thing for that generation. And you know, you're up 3 a.m. doing a term paper and you use it, and basically not much different than PEDs with athletes, right?
It's not a long-term.
What happened to the days when college students used?
There's a really interesting debate in the psychological literature over what exactly is the effect of long-term effect on your grades of using those kinds of PEDs. And the huge argument. Some people would say that you get a short-term effect, but it wears off. In other words, okay, so you stay up all night, and maybe you don't retain as well in the long term. Maybe things fall apart for you a week later because you're exhausted. There's all this it's a much more complicated question. In other words, I don't think college kids are at the same level of sophistication in their use of PEDs as Lance Armstrong was. Lance has got to go and basically start talking to the college kids about how to do it right.
Greatest cheater ever. Tell us about your book quickly. It's coming out soon.
My book is coming out October 1st, called David and Goliath, Underdog, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. And it's all about how little guys win and big guys lose. And I think it's fun.
What's your favorite chapter?
I have a chapter on the civil rights movement, which is a reinterpretation of Martin Luther King versus Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. And it's all about if you've been oppressed for 200 years, what do you learn about striking back against your oppressor? And the answer is you learn how to play tricks. And it's all about how there was a trick at the heart of the civil rights movement strategy in Birmingham. And I don't know. I found it was just incredibly. The characters from that era are so remarkable, and the stories are so unbelievable in retrospect. And the fact that it was 50 years ago in this country, there was a pitched battle going on in Alabama over whether black people should be treated like human beings. I find that so astonishing. I can't even wrap my mind around it. I mean, that's so recently.
Yeah, I just watched 42 with my daughter.
Uh-huh.
So what was that, 65 years ago, something like that?
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah,
and, it's not the greatest movie. And for some reason, Harrison Ford is the hero of the movie and not the guy who played Jackie Robinson, or they're joint heroes. But but it's worth watching. I mean, it's because my daughter, who's old enough to at least ask the right questions, was just really confused. Like, I don't understand. Why couldn't they play? Like, basic questions that we don't even think about anymore. And you're like, well, they didn't want them to play.
Not only that, but this is the great bizarre mystery about the integration of baseball, which was that every single baseball owner had hard and incontrovertible evidence for many years leading up to the decision to integrate the sport about how good black ball players were. They were not in the dark about their talent.
Right.
It wasn't that, I don't know if they're any good, maybe I'll give them a shot. They knew how good these guys were. They, in fact, sometimes would have tryouts for them, and then even faced with the evidence of the talent of these players, decide they didn't want to hire them. That's
when I spent that whole day with Bill Russell, we were talking about, Red was the first guy who started 5 black players, and he was by far the furthest ahead of everyone else in the league. Like, there was like a minimum basically where you could have people kind of had 2 or 3, and you didn't want to have more than that. And he was the first guy who was like, screw that. And he built the team around Russell and all this stuff. And Russell Russell was like, look, we won 11 out of 13. And that was one of the big reasons why, because Red did that. And he was like, Red, that's the one thing Red never got enough credit for was, first of all, how great he was about that whole situation when a lot of people weren't. But also, he was a competitive advantage. There were real reasons why he was doing it, because he knew that was a good chance for them to win. But it's something that it always gets brought up in baseball, but not with the Celtics. They won 11 out of 13.
Also puts the lie to the idea that Boston is the most kind of one of the backward cities racially in the country.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a whole other podcast. Boston's had some issues that definitely, we had some busing issues in the mid '70s, which was pretty late in the game.
You remember that? Yes.
But I think the last 20 years, I hope a lot of that stuff has gone away. I think if you're a professional athlete, there was definitely a little fear factor with Boston. I don't know how much of it was legitimate and how much of it was manufactured, but I still think Russell told me St. Louis had the first pick, and he was like, he didn't say this on camera, unfortunately, or maybe he did and we didn't use it, but he was like, if I got drafted by St. Louis, I wasn't playing there. And I was like, really? What do you mean? Like, what would you have done? He's like, I don't know. I would have played in the Globetrotters or something. I wasn't going to live in St. Louis. Are you crazy? It was 1956. I wasn't going to live there. And you don't think of St. Louis as being a scary. I mean, obviously it's not now, but it's weird to even think like at the time St. Louis was scary if you're an African American athlete. But all right, well, this was a whole tangent I didn't expect. Malcolm, thank you for coming on. We appreciate it.
I don't know. Thanks a lot, Bill.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Bye-bye.
All right, before we go, I want to talk a little bit more about the 538 thing, which I'm really excited about.
Oh yeah.
First of all, you're done with the Times at the end of this month. And
it's. There's some debate. I think I probably won't be writing for them anymore. There's some legal stuff about exactly when the contract ends, but basically, I'm kind of moving on. Yeah.
And you're hoping that your site will be optimistically January.
We're planning right now for probably January 1. We can push it back a little bit. One very nice thing about the timing here is that it's a pretty slow time in both the politics calendar and the sports calendar. Whereas next year we have a midterm election, we have a World Cup, we have a Super Bowl in New York, we have Winter Olympics, right? A lot of really interesting things in 2014. So I know from talking to you guys, you want to have your team in place so you're strong from the get-go, and there are always going to be things that you can't plan for. But we're taking our time. I mean, it's the kind of thing where we put out a product under the 538 brand, whether it's a Siskel model or a graphic or a written feature piece, right? And it's got to be good. You're kind of known for quality and differentiate in that respect, and so you can't kind of go into it in a half-assed way.
What when this came out, how many people came after you? Like, hey man, you consider me?
You get a lot of resumes. I mean, that's one of the nice things is, and some people who are more qualified than others, but a lot of really interesting resumes, and I've not even really began to sort through them. So I'm not sure when this is airing, but if you sent me your resume and haven't heard anything back, then we're kind of overwhelmed by the demand. But
it takes some time.
It takes some time, and also we're kind of, so you and I have talked about it's kind of like filling out your fantasy baseball roster. You have a budget and you're like allocating between different budgets, right? What's a little different is that it's more kind of open-ended what you want to do. So we're thinking it's more iterative, right? Where you're like, well, this wasn't part of our plan, but this person is really good, and actually it is kind of a good fit with what we might want to do. And so, so you kind of invent a new position, right? Like rover instead of shortstop or something. So you have more degrees of freedom with the budget and the vision for the site. So that makes it's really stimulating. It's a really unique opportunity, but also it's hard work too.
And just so people don't think you're disappearing from everywhere for months and months, like if you write anything, if you're inspired over the next few months, you'll have a little temporary home on Grantland.
Yeah, it'll be like Grantland / the temporary home of 538. And we talked about this too. It's we're gonna make it clear that this is gonna be an interim site, right? Because we want to make time. I mean, we're talking with really good art directors and designers, and so we really want to have something very 538 and distinct out the gate, but I also have things to write about. There's this
there's a lot going on.
Interminable mayor's race in New York, for instance. I'd like to maybe write more about some of this media stuff with the Washington Post and stuff. So there'll be a venue soon for me to write.
It's almost like you're a franchise that moved into a city and your arena's not built yet. So you're playing a couple games in our arena.
Yeah, it's like when the Ottawa Senators first moved in, they had like 9,000 capacity stadium or something. Somebody should do a piece on that, like the crappiest interim venues in the history of sports.
Yeah, I hope we're not one of the crappiest.
No, it's actually a pretty nice place. Yeah.
I hope we're at least mediocre.
No, it's more than mediocre.
And then if you end up signing any writers, then they could play in your little interim arena.
Yeah, that's right too. And look, we're starting to talk to people and kind of make job offers to candidates in the fairly near term here. In part because people we think that are smart and are kind of team players, like we really value their input. And this is another thing that's very different about kind of going from the Times, where you have a lot of kind of little islands at a very interesting archipelago, whereas here it really is more like we're making decisions as a team and as a group, and kind of using people's opinions and networks, and we have a lot of good choices, so we're kind of vetting people multiple times. So we really want to bring people in who we think are kind of glue guys who kind of just help enhance the vision for the site.
Right. And I think one thing to remember is whenever this site launches, and this is something that I hope people realize when we did Grantland, and some people didn't, but you're not who you are coming out of the gate.
No.
You're a form of who you are, and you're not going to have as many people as you end up with when you start. You're not going to have all the writers that you're going to have 18 months later. And the goal is to kind of head in the direction where you're going, but with the end goal of like, all right, 18 months from now, here's where we want to be.
That's right. I mean, out the gate, if you kind of bet 600, right? Like, 3 to 5 things that you try work pretty well.
Yeah.
And one thing isn't terrible, but doesn't really resonate, right? And you're going to have some things that really are just bad. I mean, I know we're going to hire a dozen people or 15 people, right? You're going to have someone who just, you ask to move to New York and they find, I hate New York, I'm going back to Cleveland or whatever, right? You're going to have someone who is hired and 2 months later they get a job offer from some big baseball team or investment firm or something, right? You're going to have someone who you have a personality clash. And so you have to tolerate having some churn, right? That's healthy within reason. But the flip side of that
you have
is
some
also,
trial and error.
Well, like I was talking to Jacoby before, right? And this whole thing, the importance of this as a part of Grantland's portfolio wasn't necessarily a part of the vision at first.
No, you know what? The initial idea was I wanted to have a podcast, but with an audience, and we're going to have bands, and there was going to be like a stage, and then somehow we ended up converting an electrical closet into a podcast studio.
I mean, who would have thought that? Who would have thought that like Jalen Rose would be so incredibly
you don't know.
talented, right?
That's the great thing. I mean, this is the first piece I wrote for Grantland was about my experience on Kimmel's show and how that first year we had all these great ideas, and then you try some of them and they don't work. You try some other ones, they stick, and after about a year or so, you start heading to where you want to be. I think for what we did with Grantland, I didn't feel like we were who we were until about maybe the 18-month mark. It was the first time I was like, oh, like we're getting close to. But we're 26 months in, and there's still things I want to get better at and directions we want to go in, and I don't think you ever feel like you're totally done.
No, and ESPN does have a history of kind of like Amazon actually, of you invest in a product for the long term. I mean, one of the whole problems we kind of criticize as fans, like GMs in basketball, baseball can make short-term decisions, right?
Right.
But if you're going to lose your job in 2 years, if you don't start winning more games, right, then you have every incentive to compromise your franchise's long-term future. And here I don't feel that, right? Here I feel like, look, 2016's a big year because of the fascinating election that we'll have, but this is really a 3, 4, 5 multi-year play.
Right.
And they're buying the brand, and people ask, well, why did you sell the 538 brand? Well, it's because you have someone who can be more invested in the long term and not be worried that, you put resources in and then they come right back out when Nate's contract is expired. So to have that is a very luxurious situation in some ways. But it also means that you can take some chances and take some risks, and you're going to have some products that that don't work, some contributors that don't work, right? But you're also going to have some kind of real home runs, I think, and things that you didn't necessarily expect, and people who become household names a couple years from now,
right,
that you didn't think would be beforehand.
And you have the advantage, which we didn't have, which is you're blowing out something that already worked.
We are blowing. Well,
you know what I mean?
Can say you're kind of building off your stuff at ESPN.
But it was just me. Like
yeah.
you had a little staff there, and you were trying some different things, and like this is just a logical move for you.
The scary thing is that there's no, or the good thing and the scary thing is that there's no at this time direct competitor to what 538 will be. We're taking what I call this more horizontal approach. You have an article about the new jobs numbers juxtaposed with the question about where's the best taco in Los Angeles. Give you some metrics for that, right?
Right.
Juxtaposed with something on some NBA trade, right?
Yeah.
That's different and it's new. But it's gonna. One thing we talk a lot about is we want the site to feel coherent, right? So the visual design is important to us in part because it can make different pieces feel like it's part of a unified whole, right? We might actually have a fairly strict style guide, right? We want people to not use different conventions for how you refer to players and teams and so forth, because we want it to feel kind of coherent. You let people have voice, but with enough constraints where it's not like 12 different fiefdoms, and that balance is going to be challenging. But we've thought a lot about it, and from your experience and from my experience at 538 at the Times and Baseball Prospectus and kind of writing on my own, I've now had like 4 or 5 different doses of things, and so you can kind of pick and choose what worked and what didn't, and hopefully you're batting a little bit better than even, right?
Do you feel like you initially came up with Pacoda, then you basically broke how to figure out the elections, and I remember you mentioned another time like deep down like it would be fun to come up with a third thing. Is that something in the back of your head?
Yeah, and we've talked about things that we aren't even.
Yeah, don't say them.
Some ideas we think are fun and goofy, but some things that we think are really interesting that are very doable. And that but we have some ideas and having these kind of long-term features and projects. One thing about our we're going to have, like I said, a lot of guys who are people think of as graphics guys. We think of them as interactive journalists, really, where you might take a feature where instead of saying, well, Nate has some idea, let's design a graphic around it. It's like the graphics guys have an idea of something that can be represented really well through an interactive feature, an interactive graphic. That's going to be our lead piece this week, right? And people can write some copy around that. And so thinking about, having models and metrics and tools that I think of as kind of things that are like sandboxy. So I wrote for a piece for New York Magazine a couple years ago about what the best neighborhood in New York is, right? And of course it's a magazine, so it's static, and so Park Slope or whatever was the winner. But my idea was to have it entirely be you tweak the settings as much as you want. If you're like me and like I said, like 80% of what you care about in neighborhood is access to like good food, right, and close to public transit, then you might have a very different
tweak the model, right,
of where you want to live than someone who is actually trying to raise a family or has to be really close to work or wants to be close to the airport or whatever else. So to have things where like prediction is important and it's fun to like kind of rank things and rate things, but sometimes just saying we've done a job of taking a data set and presenting it to you in a way where you get to play around with it in a way that's really, really fun and approachable and kind of come to your own conclusions a little bit more. I think it builds trust and transparency, and so that kind of thing might be a project that we're interested in.
Was it weird when all this leaked out that so much of it was misreported?
So, I mean, to get a little...
I mean, we don't have to go too inside baseball.
Yeah, a little inside baseball.
People seem to think you're like going to be on TV all over the place, and you're really just, you're doing this site, and you've been ABC News, and that's going to probably be it.
Yeah, some things got the gap in between when we informed people we weren't going with and when it became a news story was conspicuously short, right?
Right.
But we won't get in. But this is not a TV play first and foremost. It's a kind of web play. We want to call it a web magazine or a website, right? We don't really call it a blog anymore, but that's another discussion.
You're creating a content website.
It's a content website, right? And that's the first focus. And look, maybe by middle of next year, I'm sure I'll be on ABC News some, and maybe once you kind of get the whole team in place, a little bit more TV. But this is a digital first brand by ESPN, and especially this is, I think, somewhat true for Grantland stuff as well, where you tend more toward long form, right? Look, we're a details-oriented site, and we want to tell the story in our way, in our venue, because we think that story is really compelling. And there are certainly some TV outlets at ESPN and ABC and everywhere else where you can retain enough of your voice, but we don't want like the dumbed down version of things, because we think the devil's in the details a lot. So calibrating that in the right way is going to be something. It's going to be one of the bigger challenges, and I'm sure I'll be on ESPN stuff like more than I was last year and stuff. But it really is a digital first brand, and really kind of having our own voice more than trying to be replicate someone else's.
Well, I'm excited for it. I think this was a great move. It was the right time of your career to do it. I'm excited to watch it grow and figure out what you do with it. So we're thinking somewhere between January and March next year. January optimistic.
I mean, there's no official date, but we'd like to get things launched, right? In part because you can do too much pre-planning as well, where because we have growing pains, and we want to be, we'd love to be fully have some of those kinks worked out by the middle of 2014, when you have the World Cup, and then you kind of lead into to the midterm elections, and so there's a point at which maybe you have to kind of have some trial by fire, but certainly want to have the team in place. And we're also aware, again, a little inside baseball, but to have infrastructure in place, meaning editors and managers and designers and tech people, whereas I think the writing part, not the easiest part. I really have respect for people who can take difficult material and write or present it compellingly, but it's a little bit more modular. Whereas if you launch a site without enough editors, then you're screwed, right? It's going to undermine everything else. So we're very alert.
I learned that the hard way.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying impolitely or politely to kind of work around.
We had a 6-person staff when we launched. I mean, it was really a soft launch, but our mistake was we should have made that a lot more clear that this was a 3-month test period as we ended to where. But that's the thing. You do something like this, you live and you learn, you make mistakes, and hopefully, the way this launches, I think, will be a little more seamless. Mainly because ESPN as a company, I think, learned from our experiences and will have a better idea how to do it and help you and guide you. And
the timing is good, like I said, where we can really have this kind of build up to the events later in 2014 and then to 2016, and we already have some of our secret ideas. We have, timing for some of the weaker spots in the news cycle for when you might launch like those other types of products. So.
All right, so we're going to check in with you on the BS report maybe in like October, November, see how it's coming along.
Of course.
You'll be in the bunker.
In the bunker, yeah.
You'll probably have a few hires by then.
We'll have a few hires by then. I mean, hopefully pretty soon. But, I'm sure there'll be a lot of trips out here back and forth. I still think it's a glamour, like the JFK to LAX flight, I think is still
the best.
Kind of glamorous.
It's good. It's always nice. You come in, the sun's shining. Nate Silver, great to have you aboard. Really looking forward to seeing what you do with the 538 brand at ESPN. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bill.
So I get to sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNRadio.com.
Peace out.
Geico presents Strange Savings Stories. Astronomers detected an interstellar transmission. It stated, Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. The implications were staggering. Was the cosmos telling us we could all save hundreds on car insurance with Geico? Or did their radar merely pick up a signal from the nearby Rufus and Clyde's morning show? We may never know.
Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.